Welcome in. I'm Mike, K0NGA. You may know me as the Conga Man, as some people call me. You also may hear me on the RMHAM DMR TechNet first Saturday of the month at 7 p.m. on the Rocky Mountain Talk Group on the RMHAM DMR network. Shameless plug. All right, so today we are here to talk about DMR. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Anytone. I know we got some folks in the room today that have brought other radios besides Anytone. That's fine. The software and the screenshots and the demos you'll see today are focused on Anytone, but the concepts are the same regardless of what DMR radio you have, provided you have an appropriate DMR radio. This is one of the things we'll talk about. All right? So the first thing I do anytime I do a DMR presentation, if anybody's been in my DMR presentation knows, what's going on here? There we go. It's something that I call the DMR doctrine because it's alliteration, so it has to be a D, right? So we talk about DMR in terms of amateur radio, right? So we always level set with this. Very first thing to understand, okay? DMR is a commercial radio protocol. It is not focused on amateur radio, okay? It was not designed for amateur radio. It was never really intended for amateur radio, okay? Which means that some of the things about this, if you're new to DMR, some of these concepts are not going to make sense out of the gate, okay? Because they were not focused on amateur radio. Just accept it. Don't argue with it. Don't question it. Just accept it because it's a commercial radio protocol. It's not going to change, right? It's designed for commercial use. The terms are commercial use type terms. They're based on commercial concepts, and we're shoehorning it into amateur radio use. So we need to go to it because it is never going to come to us. Okay? Any questions on this before we begin? Excellent. Very good. So, for the workshop, write this down. This is going to be information for my little hotspot up here. And our goal at the end of this is for those of you that can actually get stuff into the radio to be able to transmit onto the hotspot, which will be very, very cool. So, anytime you're looking to communicate with a repeater that's new that you need to program your radio for, there's certain things you need to know. Okay? And we're gonna go into this in detail, but for now, just write this down. So we've got a 438.675 transmit with a -5 offset for receive on the repeater, color code 1, time slot 2, and talk group 3108. In case you're wondering, that is a Brandmeister talk group. We like to use Brandmeister for this because we can't really get to a repeater from here, and the hotspots connect in with Brandmeister very easily, so we use that for demo. I'll give you a few more moments to write this down. So 438.675, -5 offset, color code 1, time slot 2, talk group 3108. And hopefully by the time we get to the end of the first section of this presentation, you'll understand what all this means, if you don't already. Question, Willem.
How come the color code is 1? Why is it not red or green?
We're about to go over that in the next section. Speaking of, let's talk about what we're going to go over today. We're going to review our DMR basics. We're going to talk about Anytone specific stuff because there is some stuff on the Anytone side that you will want to know. We're going to talk about what you need to know, go over the programming workflow, right? And then we'll be doing a demo after we get through the programming demo, the workflow. All right. Let's review some basics. There's a nice little fun quote for you there. Story of my life. What is DMR? Or what's this whole turbo thing, right? The DMR is an international commercial radio standard that originated in Europe. It's not even American. Imagine that, okay? Now, turbo, typically, at a high level, refers to Motorola's implementation of the DMR protocol. They branded it as Moto Turbo. So in the early days of DMR coming into amateur radio, you started hearing about turbo networks and all these kind of things. It's just branding on the Motorola side, okay? Many amateur radio networks, again, still use moto turbo equipment, us included. So you see these referred to as turbo networks, even though there's no speed increase as a result of it. You do not have to have a Motorola radio to use these networks, obviously, because this is an Anytone session, right? So why do we care about DMR, right? This is a very, very old slide. I've been using this for years and years and years and years. So the whole concept here is with a DMR radio, they use a technology at the bottom there called TDMA. So you have time division multiplexing, whatever the acronym is up there, you can see it. So what that means, and that's when we talked about that repeater slot that you saw in the information that you wrote down. There's two time slots or repeater slots, two different terms for the same thing, in a single repeater, okay? So you can have two people talking on time slot 1 with two radios, while two other people with two different radios talk on time slot 2 on the same repeater at the same time using the same repeater pair, the frequency pair. So it acts like two repeaters in one repeater, which is very cool, right? On top of that, because it is a commercial repeater, it is using narrowband, right? So 12.5 instead of 25 kilohertz, right? So what that means is that if you have a 25 kilohertz allocation, you can fit two of these repeaters in the same wideband allocation that you could with one wideband amateur radio repeater, right? Ham radio repeater. So two repeaters, each repeater acting like two repeaters, you now have 4 virtual repeaters in the same bandwidth space as one wideband amateur radio repeater. So these took off very quickly, right? In the early days, people were talking about, well, we don't really know if DMR is going to be a thing, and by then the horse had gone out of the barn. DMR Mark was the thing, Brandmeister came on board, and everything has just exploded. So now it's more rare just to find a large amateur radio club in America that doesn't have a DMR repeater than does. And then that's ignoring hotspots. Hotspots are a whole other topic, right? So this DMR thing has really, really already taken off. But that's where this came from. Now, what made the Moto Turbo repeaters really popular is that on top of just having a regular DMR repeater, they had this feature called IP Site Connect, which was built into the repeaters that allowed you to connect repeaters over IP networks, right? So now not only do you have a digital repeater, but you have a built-in connectivity option. So they became very, very popular. So that's kind of the very, very broad stroke overview of how these things became very, very, very popular. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about what differentiates DMR, which is a commercial protocol, versus what you may be used to in standard amateur radio. Right now, we still have a frequency pair. That's nothing new. Okay? You have this concept now, what's called a color code. Now, this functions similarly, or serves the same purpose as a CTCSS or a DCS tone. It is not a tone. Right? It is a code, which isn't a color, it's a number. Right? Terminology, commercial terminology, so it's just accept it. Don't question, just accept it. So what that means is that if you were in a busy area, theoretically, and you have two repeaters that have the same frequency pair, they can have different color codes and they won't bump into each other. That kind of a thing, right? Now, this means, though, that if you're going to try to access a DMR repeater, you have to know the color code of that repeater, right? So you have to know that, okay? You have to know the repeater slot, also called the time slot. You have to know which slots you're on, because you're talking on time slot 1, somebody else is trying to contact you in time slot 2, you're going to pass in the night, you'll never know. So you have to know which time slot you want to talk on. And then further, and this is where things get really, really fun, is a thing called a talk group. So on that time slot, you can further divide access, and I call it divide access. It's really just allow or prevent access, using what's called a talk group. You have talk group 1, talk group 2, talk group 3, talk group 4. And if you program your radio as intended, if you're talking on talk group 1 on time slot 1, and someone is talking on time group 13 on time slot 1, you won't hear each other. Not only that, but if you're transmitting on talk group 1 on time slot 1, somebody tries to transmit on another talk group on time slot 1, they're going to get a busy signal. So you can only have one transmission going on a talk group at a time. Now, the early days of DMR was very, very popular for your very, very enthusiastic clubs to put up a DMR repeater, set up your 2 talk groups, and then have like 30,000 talk groups on each time slot. And then nobody could communicate because no one could get in because everybody was fighting over access to the time slot. Learned that lesson pretty quick, okay? And then finally, we have a thing called a receive group. So a talk group is on the transmit side of your channel. What talk group am I talking to? The receive group is on the receive side of your channel. Which talk groups am I listening for? Now, obviously, you want to have your talk group that you're trying to communicate on in a receive group so that you can talk back and forth. But because you can have more than one talk group on a time slot, it's really, really beneficial to add the other talk groups that are on that time slot into your receive group so that they're transmitting, you can hear it and you know, oh, the time slot's busy, right? Questions on any of this? Because this is DMR in a nutshell. This is what when we program a channel, this is what we're concerned with. This is the whole kit shebang here, right? If we didn't want to go into detail, we could stop the presentation right now because that is all that we're talking about today. All of this and all the things built around it. Willem.
Like having multiple talk groups on the time slot seems like a terrible idea because if you can hear the other talk groups, but they can't hear you. They didn't program in their receive list. You could be talking and they could be interrupting your conversation, right? So unless everybody has all of those talk groups on the time slot in their receive groups, this doesn't work very well. Is that true?
In amateur radio land, yes. But remember, this is a commercial radio protocol. So in commercial settings, this is by design. But because we have to adopt this in the amateur radio group, we try to keep it simple. Multiple talk groups on a receive group can be very, very confusing. Okay? Multiple talk groups on a time slot can be very confusing, right? So at RMHAM, we took that to heart, right? And these decisions were made by very smart people even before I came on board. So we have a philosophy with our network, 1 talk group per time slot. It's our keep it simple, stupid approach to this. With a few exceptions, but generally speaking, for the ones that we control, one because again, it gets very, very confusing very quickly. Okay, but yes, that is a very, very important design decision that the repeater owners have to make, and we tend to keep it simple. Jeff.
Turn it off. That's squelch. Wait 3 seconds. Okay, just to illuminate and reinforce what Mike is saying and your question about colliding with everybody. This is a commercial protocol. Yeah. It was never intended to be used for amateur radio, and the designers weren't even thinking about that. Yeah. But if you think about if a frequency is licensed to a town, for example, you might have all kinds of different departments that are going to use that frequency. So the radio shop might assign a talk group to the, to the street sweepers. And they might assign a different talk group to the police department. And they really don't want those 2 organizations talking to each other, but they share the frequency. It probably wouldn't be the police department. It would probably be a lesser used. And the thing of it is that once, if the frequency is available, so as soon as somebody keys up, the frequency is no longer available. So if the street sweepers are talking to each other, and the parking meter people want to say, and then they hit their transmit button, they'll get a deny tone. Yep. But usually, by the time they take their finger off the button and hit it again, the guys are finished talking, so then they'll get the frequency. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's why you have different talk groups. Exactly. So that whoever owns the frequency, and it might be a town or a company or something like that, can segment that frequency amongst its users. Yeah. And they don't want to talk to each other. The city doesn't want them talking to each other.
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, in commercials, it's designed for commercial settings where that is the desired thing.
The key being, though, that there's one person that programs the radio, right? In the amateur world where it's the Wild West, this could lead to a lot of confusion.
The Wild West, for sure. Question?
Yes, you mentioned getting a deny tone. Does that mean that our radios operate in duplex and they listen at the same time that they transmit so that we immediately get a tone, or that when you quit transmitting you get a you stepped on somebody, so it didn't go through.
So this is the advantage of having a digital radio, right? Because what happens is that when you hit that button, you're just not transmitting, you're connecting to the repeater. There is an acknowledgement handshaking process, right? So if you transmit and it's busy transmitting, the radio goes, oh, somebody's already transmitting, and the radio knows that because of the digital nature of it, and it'll say, nope, sorry, beep, nope, you can't use it. That's the advantage of having digital radios. It's fantastic. All right.
Question.
Oh, another question?
Yeah, online, on Zoom.
Excellent.
So I've been playing with this for about a year or so. I saw the receive group in the CPS, often wondered what it was. Now that I know what it is, it appears that RMHAM doesn't use that. The code plug that I downloaded, receive groups are not there. So just curious.
We do use them, but and this is one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about Anytone stuff, right? So there are radios on the market, especially Motorola. They're fantastic radios, but they're more geared towards your commercial customers. Since DMR has been introduced into amateur radio, there are now companies like Anytone that make DMR radios that cater to amateurs, to amateur radio enthusiasts like us, right? And there is a feature on the Anytone radios. It's called different things in different radios. It's called a different thing in the TYT. The TYT started out with a third-party experimental firmware. They called it promiscuous mode, which is a network term. So it functions, but it really was a thing. In Anytone, it's called something that is more radio focused. It's called digital monitor. Okay. Now, the way the receive group is supposed to work is that if there is a talk group transmitting on a time slot, and that talk group is not in your receive group, it's not supposed to key up your radio so that the audio comes through. That's the way it's supposed to work. If you enable digital monitor, the radio ignores the receive group, and then any talk group that transmits on that time slot will key up the speaker on the radio. Beyond that, there is now a dual slot digital monitor. So if your channel is programmed to listen to time slot 1, and you turn on dual digital monitor, and someone transmits on time slot 2, your radio will turn on the speaker and you'll be able to listen. So in the amateur radio world, the need for the receive group has lessened, but it's also important that you know what that receive group is for and understand it, so when you're troubleshooting, you're better at troubleshooting issues and those kind of things, right? Willem.
Thank you.
If you have promiscuous mode turned on, and let's say somebody makes a call on talk group 720, but your transmit group is on 710, when you reply to them, they're not going to hear on the other side unless they're also in that same mode. Is that true?
That is correct. So it's very important to understand that. Again, when someone transmits, you will see on your screen what talk group that it keyed up your radio. And you have to know what talk group am I transmitting on so that you can actually have a conversation back and forth.
Yeah, so on the Anytone, I understand, the digital monitor, but it does have an option if you only want like 2 or 3 talk groups. You can program a receive group if you want to, kind of like optional if you don't want to receive everything in promiscuous or
That's correct.
digital monitor.
That's the normal operation. Promiscuous mode is a feature, so that the normal operation is without it. Got a question in the audience? Just a second.
Yes, if you were trying to use a particular time slot, let's say time slot 1.
Yes.
If I understand right, you would interfere with, or rather be blocked by somebody else using time slot 1.
Correct.
Why would you ever want to turn on the dual monitoring such that you also hear time slot 2, which just, first off, it's not going to block you, it's not what you're desiring, and want to just confuse you if you hear that?
That's a very good question. So those of you that are kind of newer to DMR, some of the technologies and approaches that have come out in the greater DMR world have gone a little crazy. The best example I can give of this is Brandmeister. Okay, so Brandmeister is still, it's really, really crazy. And you could have somebody that has a Brandmeister repeater or even your own hotspot that has a dual hat on it and have some talk groups assigned to time slot 1 and some talk groups that are on time slot 2. Scenario. Let's say that I want to be able to know when somebody transmits on several different state-based talk groups, but I also want to know when somebody transmits on the global United States one, 3100, right? And I want to be able, anytime someone transmits on the 3100, I want to be notified of that regardless of what's going on with the other talk groups. Again, this is a real scenario that people set up their hotspots for. So I would assign 3100 to a time slot, and I would assign all my other talk groups to the other time slot, and then put on dual monitor. So that then if somebody transmits on the Colorado talk, we're really good. But as soon as somebody transmits on the 3100, it comes in the other talk group, and I can hear it. Now, if I had assigned that to the same talk group, if Colorado's transmitting and someone transmits on 3100, it doesn't come in because the talk group's busy, or the time slot's busy. So that is a sample scenario where that would be desirable. It's a kind of advanced, geeky reason for it, but those reasons do exist. Now, if you're just doing something like talking to a group or talking to, like on an event, where you only want to be on that one talk group, obviously you don't want to use that. But it is very situational, but it's also very powerful. Dave?
So on the with the hotspot specific, because isn't it possible to set that up that whatever you hear, it translate whatever talk group you have to your hotspot, it would go to whatever you hear?
Yes, but you can have more than one talk group open on it as well.
Okay.
So yeah. All right, let's dig into some of the Anytone specific stuff. So this is another quote. This is something it's one of my other pet peeves. Somebody and their dog will come up with this brand new radio, will get marketed as the next best thing in DMR radios, and somebody will buy it, and then they'll come to me and say, well, why don't you have a code plug for it? Because it was only released yesterday, and nobody uses it, right? So we'll get a little bit more into this, but that's actually something that somebody has emailed me or asked me at a show, okay? Time for me to rant, as if I haven't already, okay? So these are generalizations. They're not always true. You can always find exceptions, but generally, Chinese radios tend to be more affordable than Motorola's. If you look at the 380s, 390s on TYT, I think they're going for like $90 on Amazon now. Dude, tell you what, okay? They're less expensive to purchase. This is no longer true. The CPSs are typically free. That's also true, but Motorola has changed their policies on CPS. Hallelujah. Typically, each Chinese radio, and moreover, each model within a company of Chinese radio, comes with its own CPS, which won't work with other radios, even radios within their own family. So here I have 3 Anytones, an 868, an 878, and an 8782. Each one of those has their own CPS, and the CPS won't work with the other radios. On that table right there. Welcome to Chinese radios. Okay? Each CPS, and then generally speaking, this is amongst families, so not within the same one, but different, like the TYT versus the Anytone. Each one will have their own quirks. Very, very annoying. So I can program this, and you go to another CPS. It's like, where did they put that? Why is it like that? It's nuts. Still the wild, wild west. Okay. Terms will differ. Time slot versus repeater slot, kind of things. Things that should be pull-down menus in some are buttons in others. Get me started. Settings will be in different places. That's pretty common. And this is my biggest rant. Just because it's the newest doesn't mean it's better than what came before. Very, very easy in today's day and age in DMR and amateur radio to get caught up in the latest, greatest thing, right? There's latest, greatest Anytones. Everybody comes out with all these different things with all these different bells and whistles features. And then they say, well, how much is the radio? $900, right? I can buy a 380 on Amazon for $110 and get everything I need to get on the air, right? And this radio, this 380 is how old now? 6 years, 7 years old? And it works great. It works just fine for 99% of what you need to do. Just because it's newest doesn't mean it's best. Okay, Dave?
Yeah, with the, CPS, it was, typically used to that with, Motorola, is a lot of the, someone call it a programming software or whatever. So are most of them referring to to CPS with some of the various programs for the radios now and just kind of adopted that as the generic term for the programming software?
Correct. So CPS is customer programming software. It's a term that it came out of the commercial radio world. It's something that the Chinese radio people have adopted. Everything's called CPS. You go on Google, Anytone CPS, it'll take you where you can download the Anytone programming software. CPS is now, it's like Xerox. It's a generally accepted term for radio programming software. Will?
Are there any specific radios that you have to stay away from? I'm thinking mostly Tier 1 radios.
Correct. So there are some radios that we have on our website that have been listed. Hasn't been the case for a long time, thank goodness. There are different types of DMR, different tiers. Generally, what we saw in the early days were Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 2 is a radio that supports both time slots. Tier 1, I think, was one time slot and one, what was it, like a digital one, not. What we ran into with some of these cheaper radios, and they were cheaper radios, okay, they marketed themselves as Tier 2 radios. But when you transmitted on a time slot, it actually transmitted on both time slots simultaneously. This is a very, very bad thing because it caused interference. We were able to isolate them. We put out a big notice, please do not use these radios on the RMHAM network because they cause interference. And as far as I know, it turned out it was more of a hardware problem than a software problem because they couldn't fix it in firmware. So those radios, at this point, it's pretty much gone the way of the dodo. They work fine if you have a single slot hotspot because you're not going to get in trouble with that, but on actual repeaters, don't use them. We can look at them up later and see what the actual routers are, but it's so esoteric now that it's very, very rare to run across them unless someone's having a fire sale on DMR radios on eBay. Be very, very, very cautious if it's a radio that you've never heard of and they're selling it for like $50 on eBay. Be very cautious. All right, that's my rant. And let's talk about some Anytone models. This is where we start getting into some geeky stuff. This is cool stuff. All right, so let's start out with the HTs. Vanna White over here. So the first model that I remember coming out and that I bought was the 868. So what does this ATD868UV really mean? AT means Anytone. D means digital. 868 is the model, and UV? UHF, VHF. Dual band. Excellent. So that is the radio here with the orange button on top. Okay? I don't think it didn't come with GPS or Bluetooth, to my memory. Kind of basic one. It had enough memory, I think, for like 100 or 200,000 contacts. We'll talk about contacts in a bit. And it was the first foray. It was the first real valuable dual band radio that came out for amateur radio. It was a big thing. Very, very big thing. Because everybody had been saying, we want dual band, we need VHF, HF, we need it, we didn't need it. They finally came out with it. And most of our repeaters in Denver are still UHF. We have a few VHF, but still not as big as UHF in Denver. Next model to come out was the 878. That was a jump. So we have the nice little blue button on top, right? That added Bluetooth and GPS. So now we can start doing things like APRS send, digital and analog APRS send, and those kind of things. And then they came out with the 878 UV2, which had even more storage space for contacts and could do APRS receive. This is now, I think, the only model that they sell, the 878-2. Okay? Now, as I was telling some folks when I came in, I just discovered that they're coming out with a new model. So they're actually going downstream with this one. Okay, the D168UV. This one is going to be a smaller form factor. It's going to have a little bit newer electronics, but no Bluetooth and no GPS. And right now, Bridgecom has them pre-order for about $200. So this is now the most affordable Anytone that you can get in. If you don't need the Bluetooth, you don't need the GPRS, so you don't need to be able to do APRS send with GPS beaconing, $200, and you've got a nice Anytone dual band radio. CPS looks almost exactly the same. They're not going to be compatible between, but the CPS looks exactly the same. So this is really cool. I'm excited about this one. Then we have the mobiles. The mobiles are pretty straightforward. You have the 578. Now, actually, just so there's no confusion, it's the AT D578 UV3 Pro and Plus. All right. I think the 3 was meant to indicate that it was tri-band, so it also has the 220 band on the radio, right? The Plus added aircraft monitoring, aircraft frequency monitoring, right? And right now, the Plus is the only thing that they actually manufacture and sell. You might find some Pros that are still that haven't been sold out yet, but they don't manufacture the Pro anymore. It's all Plus. It's essentially the same radio, except for the aircraft band. Okay. Now, here's the fun part. Each one of these require their own CPS. The only kind of exception for this is the 578. But realistically, the 578 Pro and Plus are the same radio, just with an extra feature on it, so they didn't have to redo the CPS. But each one of these has their own CPS. So you have to make sure you download the correct CPS for your radio. Okay? The site that I go to for me to make sure that I have the latest supported and good CPS is the Bridgecom site. Okay? They typically will have the newest software first, and their site is pretty comprehensive on the firmwares and the CPS in a bundle. Okay? So if you search for Bridgecom AT-D78 UV2 firmware or CPS, it should come up in the Google search results for this link for the site that has all the downloads for those. Pretty straightforward. Okay? Any questions on this? On the models? Okay? Obviously, the CPS is specific to each model, so is the firmware. This is where the 578 deviates. There are separate firmwares for the Pro and Plus. They're called V1, V2. So V1 is the Pro, V2 is the Plus. Kind of seems backwards, but trust me on that. Pro is V1, Plus is V2. So be aware of that. And now, they've pretty much stopped developing firmware for the 868. I think the last release for an 868 firmware was like in 2021. But they are still developing for both 878 models and for the 578 models. Questions here? All right. Now, yeah, so the 168 was new. All right. What you need. I love this quote. One of my favorite ones. Had a gal call. I was working in AOL. I got, it was in a tech support call. Gal couldn't get online. Started to do the troubleshooting sections, and I discovered very quickly that she couldn't tell me anything about her computer, but she had detailed information about the modem that she had. And I said, ma'am, do you have a computer? No. Well, you need a computer to run the software. No, I don't. Well, ma'am, yeah, you have to use, what do you mean? It says, well, it says here on your disk that all I need is this disk and a modem, and I can get online. It's like, no, ma'am, you need a computer. Say, well, this is false advertising. I'm going to sue. Here's the number for our legal department. Have a nice day. Actual support call that I took when I was working tech support for AOL way back in the day. All right. So what do you need to get online with DMR? What do you think the first thing that you need? Radio. Awesome. So again, like I said, a tier 2 radio. These are very, very common. If you buy an Anytone, you're going to get a tier 2 model. This is an Anytone session. The TYTs have both single band and dual band. So the 390 and the 380 are different from the UV 380 and 390. The UV is dual band. Okay. You'll need a programming cable, and each radio will come with its own programming cable. Thankfully, generally speaking, within the same family, the programming cables will be the same. So a TYT programming cable is a TYT programming cable. An Anytone programming cable is an Anytone programming cable, with the exception of the mobiles, because the mobile, the 578s use a micro USB connector instead of a radio connector. And the 168 that I mentioned before, the new one, is going to be programmed via USB-C cable. Yes. Hallelujah. No, the Anytone 168. USB-C cable, USB-C data cable. So for charging and for programming. Finally, Dave.
So is it Bluetooth? Is that supported for the programming on the Anytone?
No, cable only. Not a Motorola. All right, you will need the programming software. Now this is another rant, and this is not directed at anybody particularly or anything like this. It's just something for me. RT Systems sells programming software for the Anytone, okay? If you're an RT Systems fan and you're familiar with the RT Systems software, by all means get it. It is not necessary to program your Anytone radio to have the RT Systems software, okay? It is free. It's available for download from the Bridgecom and other sites. And my microphone thing just fell off there. So it is not necessary. So don't feel like you need to go and get the RT Systems software. You do not, okay? Rant over. All right, you will need a Windows computer. I know in the amateur radio community there is a big fan base for Mac and for Linux. I am one of these people that is a Linux fan. However, when you are a radio manufacturer, and I say I need to create software for my people to program their radios, by and large, it is very obvious to anybody that is honest about it, the vast majority of computers that are out in the world that people have run Windows. So if they're going to minimize the development costs to give you this free software, they're going to make it for Windows. Willem.
The vast majority of computers that are out there runs Linux.
That's a phone.
Every phone runs Linux.
Does your phone have a USB-A port, Willem?
No.
Okay. So, yes, it is going to run in Windows. No, they're probably not going to develop for any other operating system. Deal with it. Now, I run virtual machines in my Linux machine, my Linux computer, and I can plug that cable into my Linux machine and it works just fine. So you don't have to run Windows on your base OS, but you have to have Windows to program your radio. Sorry. Sorry, not sorry, because it's not my fault. I didn't make this decision. Don't blame me. I'm just a messenger here. Okay. Now, here's a new concept. You are going to need a radio ID. This is a somewhat controversial topic, but not really. Okay? You're in a digital world now. Anything that's in the digital world has to have some kind of ID, right? DMR is no different. There is a site, an organization, radioid.net, that has graciously decided to, in a free form, to be able to manage radio IDs, because in any network, you can't have two devices with the same ID. Bad things happen, or things start to break or not work. Everybody needs their own unique radio ID. You go to Radio ID, sign up for an account, upload your little downloaded license proof thing that you get from the FCC so they know that, yes, you are actually the person that has this license, and they'll issue an ID. Usually takes less than 24 hours. Okay? It's very quick. Just do it. Get your unique ID. You're going to need it. Willem.
Computer. Is it safe to run Wine or something like that in emulation to run the CPS, or will you break your radio?
I've never tried it, so I don't know. The Wine with CPS on Linux, I don't know. The reason why that is because when you plug in your cable to your Windows machine, this is what I know, that particular entity shows up as a virtual COM port. And then when you go into your software, you choose the COM port to communicate with and do that way. How that functions in Linux with Wine, I have no idea. Experiment at your own risk and at your own pace. By all means, try it. I can't guarantee that's going to work.
The radio ID is that unique per radio? Do you have 3 different IDs up there on the table, or is it an
question.
operator ID?
Excellent. So now, please be advised that this radio ID only matters in a DMR network, right? It is not a replacement identifier for your call sign. Separate thing, okay? That being said, each one of these radios that I have up here is programmed with the same radio ID, right? So all that matters is that you're only transmitting with one radio on any given repeater or network at a given time. So if I have one of these radios that's currently set up to transmit on the RMHAM network, and one of these radios set up to transmit on the Brandmeister network, I can have both those radios on at the same time, and I can transmit at the same time. They're separate networks. They don't bump into each other. Okay? Now, if I had both of these radios set up to transmit on the RMHAM network, things get much more interesting. What generally ends up happening is that if I transmit on one radio, the other radio won't receive the signal. And when that happens with people that have the same radio ID in the same room and whatnot, things get really confusing. Okay? Is it going to break the system? No. Are things going to explode? No. Is it going to cause confusion? Yeah, probably. So please just don't do it. Okay? So I have a radio in my car, and I have an HT. When I'm in the car, I have the mobile on, transmit. As soon as I'm parked, turn off your mobile, turn on your HT, go do your thing. They can have the same radio ID. It's fine. You don't need one ID per radio. Trying to count how many DMR radios I currently have in my possession. Probably about 12 or 13 radios, HTs and mobiles. I can have them all assigned the same radio ID, as long as I'm not transmitting them at the same time and trying to talk between them. It's fine. Joe? John? John?
My name.
Yes.
Just to note that we have done this in a cash radio environment where people were given radios at an event, and those cash radios came with the same ID in them. Well, it's kind of a problem because those radios will not talk to each other. Just be aware that if you're going to try to use them, they need different IDs in the DMR world.
Yes.
Now, that being said, the DMR ID guys at radioid.net are very stingy and grumpy about giving other IDs out.
Yeah.
Extremely. So what you probably want to do is have everybody in your organization request an ID, and when they have that ID, put that in your cash radios, because they are really unhappy about communicating to each other with the same ID.
Right.
That is only in the DMR world, and that is generally only in the Motorola and Seabridge world. And we run 2 Seabridges on the network, so it gets really grumpy if it has an ID mismatch. It just drops the packets from that other one. If it sees you on the network somewhere, it says, that radio is supposed to be here. It shouldn't be over here. In the cellular world, they call that a glare condition, and it just drops the packets. They're just gone. So just think about that. If you're in an environment where you have a whole lot of radios and a lot of people need to talk to each other, get IDs that are separate.
Yeah. Radio ID has no problem giving each ham their own ID. So when we try to do bulk requests for like a club for general issue radios, they tend to.
I think we were the ones that started that. We asked for 100 IDs, and they were not very happy about it. They did it eventually, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But you will need a radio ID in order to get your radio going. Okay. RadioID.net. Create an account. You'll need to download a copy of your license because they won't issue an ID unless you are actually a licensed ham. That's their checkpoint, which is perfectly fine, right? Now, if you're trying to get to a repeater or a hotspot, you will need the information about that repeater and or hotspot, right? We went over this, right? Frequency pair, color code, talk groups, time slot, right? You have to have that information. This is going to be a theme that we're going to hammer into your head. Frequency pair, color code, talk group, time slot. Those are the 4 things. The 4 pillars of DMR. I should make a slide. 4 pillars of DMR. Right there. Okay. And of course, if you know the talk group, you know what you need to put in your receive group. So the talk group is really what you need to know. From the repeater operator. Or somebody who knows a repeater operator. Right?
In RMHAM, you get it off our website.
Yes. And this is why we have a sample code plug pre-programmed all this stuff to get you online quicker. Willem.
So if I'm on a repeater and I have the right frequency pair, color code, and time slot, but I have the wrong talk group, what happens?
Oh, well, what you do is you turn off promiscuous mode or monitor on your radio, program everything else, listen, find which one they're transmitting on, and then use that as your talk group.
But so let's say the repeater is set for 720 and I use 730.
Yep, you can listen, but you won't be able to communicate with anybody because nobody's listened for 730.
So does the repeater throw those packets away, or do I tie up the time
Depends on
slot?
how the repeater is configured. As far as I know, John. So if you set up your repeater for 710 talk group and someone transmits on 730, what happens? It goes into the bit bucket. There you go.
Wrong.
Uh-oh. I hear a dud on the thing.
The repeater does not filter, or we do not program talk groups into the repeater. Whatever comes in is passed out. So if you make your own talk group, instead of, we were talking about Central 720, and you create Lozano 750, it's going to pass through the repeater. And people aren't going to be able to know. You basically hijacked our repeater, and we're going to think very poorly of you. We're going to take away your birthday. We're going to force you to clean the restrooms, and you will not be served barbecue. Yes.
Okay.
So in that case, Doug, does that go through the C bridge or just on the local repeater that you've got a mismatched talk group? If you're got 2 people that have got, say, 730 on Central, is that going to be broadcast to all of the Central repeaters or just the local repeater?
Well, and I'm sorry to answer this like a lawyer, but it kind of depends. It's going to send it to the entire, we use Motorola repeaters, and IP Site Connect is a Motorola function and feature and trademark. So whatever repeaters are connected on an IP Site Connect, it will send it to all of those. But if once it gets to the C bridge, if the C bridge is not programmed to pass it, it's not going to go forward. So it's very tricky. Just don't do it. We have programmed talk groups for a reason, and it doesn't confuse people.
Yes.
Doug, is it true that if you and your buddy both set up a different talk group, you can talk to each other on that repeater, but you are basically hijacking that repeater and nobody else can use it? Is that true? Or
Exactly.
while you're using it?
Yeah. And
So
that's why
don't
we
do it.
ask you not to do it.
We talk about very early on in your amateur radio career, when you start learning about amateur radio and getting your license, talk about operating practices, standard operating practices, and appropriate operating practices, right? The key there is not to cause interference. If you're doing these kind of things on a repeater for a network like ours, that is bad operating practices, and that is causing interference. Don't do it. You will get contacted from us. If you want to experiment, get a hotspot. Experiment on that hotspot all you want. Do not experiment on repeaters for clubs like this. They will not be appreciative of your efforts. One more comment. John?
One other information, I don't know if you cover it, but encryption on the amateur bands is very easy to do on DMR.
Yes.
Do not do it. Under any circumstances, we will come looking for you, and you will get a cease and desist letter and be banned from the system if you do it.
Encryption is not, because every DMR radio comes with the ability to do encryption. Encryption is not compatible with amateur radio requirements and standards as by the FCC. So if you get caught, they will let you know, right? And that would be a bad thing. You could lose your license for things like that. right? All right, we've gone over a lot of things. Any questions on any of this before we take a quick break? Question?
So you refer to frequency pair,
Correct.
but you only provided one frequency of 438.675. So
What was the second part of that 438.75?
I don't know. I couldn't type that fast. I was
Negative 5 offset.
Thank you.
Negative 5 megahertz offset. So that means, and this is a standard thing you'll see, repeater owners do. So 438.675, that is the transmit frequency of the repeater. Okay, so if you're listening, you need to listen on 438.675. The offset tells you what the frequency is to transmit into the repeater. So that'll be 433.675. So you'll transmit on 433.675, and the repeater listens on 433.675. So that's like using -24 instead of 255, 255, 255.0. Same kind of concept. It's just nomenclature. But very, very good question. Other questions? Will?
This is Art Bullock.
Okay, hold on.
I wanted to make a comment.
Go ahead, please.
I'm on Zoom.
Go ahead.
When we were talking, I think Willem asked the question about CPS running on Linux. I've experimented with 2 products. Both are based on Wine. One is called Code Weavers, and the other is Bottles, and both are miserable failures when trying to interpret and convert to a Linux environment. Someone smarter than me is going to have to figure out how that might work.
So when it comes to the whole Windows Linux CPS thing, ask yourself one question. How much pain do I want to experience for myself? If you do not want to experience the pain and put the portables in, you just want to get your radio programmed, just use Windows. It's the quickest path to victory. And then once you have your radio working, then go experiment to your heart's content. But Windows is going to be your quickest path to victory, in my humble opinion.
And, experience with previous manufacturers, sometimes you end up with a new doorstop.
Yes. Ooh, how many people here have never bricked a radio? Got to put my hand down. Liar. Oh, no. All right, any other questions? I have bricked several. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got one.
Let us take a 10-minute break. I have 9:26. We'll call it 9:25-ish. 10:35. Willem, can you tell us where the restrooms are? Bring up Willem to the front.
Don't need to know, but here in this room, to the right and through the doors over.
All right, we are live. Welcome back.
Don't go out
class.
during the talk because you won't be able to come back in.
I can't see my presentation. So welcome back. Hope everybody got everything they needed done, and we're going to move on to the programming workflow. Actually programming your radio. This is something that I say a lot. I say, when anybody comes up and says, can you program a radio for me? My first response is no. But I will help teach you how to program your own radio. Because if somebody is constantly programming your radio for you, you become dependent on that person for any type of operating you want to do on your radio. I hope that you're here at this class because you want to be able to do this yourself. That is the whole goal of us doing this. Okay? So, let's proceed. So, let's review our basic programming concepts. What do you need to know in order to program a DMR channel? Call Mike. What's the first thing? Frequency pair. What else? Color code. Time slot and talk groups. Very good. Got that hammered home. Comment from the Zoom.
Doing his job back here.
He's doing a different job.
All right. He says, when Mike gets to talking about the programming in CPS, make sure he touches on the fact that you can have a different radio ID per channel. also known as if you want your HTs to talk to each other, but you were only issued one radio ID, then configure a separate ID in the simplex channels.
Eh. I am not going to talk about that because that's confusing, and it's better to focus on best operating practices. Okay? Simplex is another thing, because if you think about simplex, let's say I've got 2 radios, and I'm talking simplex between 2 radios, right? What's my network? No, there is. Technically, if you want to be pedantic, there is a network. What is that network? It's a network of 2 radios. So at that point, does your radio ID matter? All that matters is that they're different. That's all that matters when you're doing simplex, okay? Do not get that concept in your head when you're going on networks, though, because you will have a bad time. But with just 2 radios on simplex, technically speaking, you're your own private network. You can do whatever you want with the radio IDs, okay? But if you want to have a larger group, like the entire RMHAM system, and they're all going to be on simplex, now do you want to have to coordinate separate IDs for everybody? No, just use your radio ID that you got from radioid.net, please. Just do it that way. Okay, rant over. Moving on. Next thing. There is what I call the order of chow to try to help keep you sane when you are putting this information into your code plug. Okay? Because when you go to create your channel, in most code plug software, you can't just simply type in a talk group. Okay? You select a talk group from a list, which means you must populate that list first. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to do once you've gathered all your information, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to populate your list of talk groups. Now, I see folks writing things down. That's fantastic. The copy of this, a PDF copy of this presentation is on the RMHAM website, on the RMHAM use page. You can download a PDF of this to review at your leisure. Okay? So, because you have to select your talk group from a list, you have to populate that list first. Okay? Same thing with the receive groups. But, how do you create your receive groups? You select your talk groups to add to your receive groups from a list. So now are two different levels of inception for lists. You populate your talk groups from a list of you populate your receive group from a list of talk groups, and then you select your receive group from your channel from a list of receive groups. You've got 2 levels of lists there. So you populate your talk groups first, you then create receive groups from your list of talk groups, and then finally, you can go to your channel, okay? So the channel is where you bring everything together. You specify your repeater pair. You specify your talk group, or your time slot. You select your talk group from the list. You select your receive group from the list, okay? And then, your final step, and this is where a lot of people get tripped up. I've programmed all my channels, I push it up to my radio, and I turn the dial and nothing happens. The last piece in the radio is something called a zone. And a zone is nothing more or less than a collection of channels. So I create a zone and I call it Mike's Preferred Channels. I put my channels into that zone. Just add them to that in the order that I want. Save it, and you push it to the radio. Then when you turn on your radio, you have a little menu that you go to. One of those menus is zone. You select Mike's Preferred List zone, and then your little dial selector knob on top is how you switch between the channels in the zone. But if you never create a zone, this never functions because it doesn't know what zone, what collection of channels you want. You have to create a zone, at least one. And you can create more than one zone ahead of time with different collections of channels, but you can only have one zone active at a time. Now, the Anytone radios will have 2, like a channel and a sub-channel, right? An active channel and a sub-channel. Each one of those channels, the active and the sub-channel, can be a different zone. Can be. So that can get a little confusing, but it is possible. All right? But you have to have your zone set up first before you can actually choose what channels you want on the radio. No, you first.
Oh, okay. So did I hear you correctly that the A and B don't have to be in the same zone?
That is correct. On an Anytone.
Oh, okay. All right.
I don't know about the other radios, but I do know for sure on an Anytone because I've done it. Question?
Yeah, I guess more of a comment. If this is for the channel, but if this is the first time that you've done your code plug and so forth, you want to make sure you've got your radio ID in before you start doing your channel.
We're getting into that real quick. Right. So generally speaking, the radio ID is a global setting, so you'll never see it on your channel. Anytone does it a little different. We're going to go into that. And remember I said up front that each CPS does things a little differently? This is one of the things that Anytone does differently. Okay. Now, I put this up here to kind of give an example because to drive home the concept that you could have more than one talk group on a time slot. Okay? Now, the first example up here is our Thornton channel. And you notice we have a time slot 1, time slot 2, but the color code and the frequency pair are the same. Right? But time slot 1 is Rocky Mountain, time slot 2 is Central. Those are the labels for our talk groups. Okay? One talk loop per time slot, to keep it simple. Now, there is DMR mark is still out there. I'm not sure if we have any DMR mark repeaters in our area, but they did things more of the other way of doing things, where they have more than one talk loop per time slot. You can see here on time slot 1, their standard configuration was to have worldwide English, and North America all on time slot 1. Okay? And then on time slot 2, you would have your more local channels, like there's always a local channel for DMR mark, which is just that repeater, and then a regional talk group such as Mountain. Okay? So this just in table form to reinforce the concept that you can have more than one talk group per time slot. We don't like it because it can cause more confusions, especially for new RAMs. And it can cause interference when we've got two people wanting to use two talk groups at the same time, and it's on the same time slot. It causes interference. Okay? But it is possible. But what this also allows you to do is in a very, very nice table format, here's all the information you need to program these channels. You've got your frequency pair, you've got your time slot, you've got your talk group, and you've got your color code. Everything's there. Right? Now, fun thing to always remember, because this, when I was early on in my amateur radio career, this always tripped me up. We've already talked about this a little bit, but I'm going to reinforce it here. When you see repeater information like this, the transmit frequency is always a frequency that the repeater is transmitting on. It is not the frequency that your radio should transmit on. It's the frequency that the repeater is transmitting on. Yes. Yes, we try to make that very clear. So the transmit for the repeater should go into the receive on your channel. Okay? Again, it's a very, very easy thing to mix up when you're new, and I know I did when I was new. And of course, the receive frequency for the repeater should be what you put on the transmit on your channel. And if your CPS is good, and people have actually put some thought into your CPS, the first box will always be the receive on the channel, and the second box will be the transmit on the channel, if they did it right, because it helps with that confusion. Okay? So there is that. All right, let's get into some specifics. The first thing we should always do with a new code plug or the new radio is go into CPS and set your radio ID. All right? In the Anytone, there is a long list along the left side here, okay? And this section, the major section, which is called digital, may not be expanded. Okay, if there's a little X next to that, a little plus next to that, you need to click the plus so that it expands out. And then you have what they call the radio ID list. Now, this is an Anytone thing, okay? Because in the Anytone, because again, these are geared more towards commercial use, they allow you to specify more than one radio ID in your CPS. Okay? In general practice, you will never use this in amateur radio. Okay? You get one radio ID from radioid.net. You put in your radio ID. Typically, what we do in DPS, in ham radio for this, under the name, you put your call sign in your first name. The general kind of a standard thing that we do. And that's it. You're done. All right? I will show you where this comes into play later. You're kind of confused on why I let you do that. I'll explain a little bit once we get to the channel. But that is how you put your radio ID into an Anytone radio. With the Titeras and the Connect systems, there's generally a general tab or general section, and there will be a box labeled radio ID or DMR ID, depending on how you decide to label it today, right? But that's where you put in your radio ID.
Yeah, just to, since this was for a new code plug, but I guess to keep in mind, if you download one of our samples off of the RMHAM network, that's one of the first things you want to do is update the radio ID to yours. Yeah. Otherwise, you'll get if a couple people download the same code plug, it's got the same radio ID, and that could cause some problems of communicating. In full disclosure, the way this is set up in the sample is that we set this as either 54321 or 12345, and in the name we put RMHAM sample, right? So if you forget to change this and you transmit on our network, we're going to come across 54321 or 12345. And we're going to know, he didn't change his radio ID. And we'll call you, we'll respond back to you and say, oh, by the way, you need to change the radio ID in your radio. You may want to go do that. Just as a friendly reminder, right? We're not going to get mad at you because everybody's done it. I've done it by accident. I've done it, okay? So it's just one of those things that go and change it so everybody's operating at the best. Questions on this? Okay, first thing, any new CPS. Next thing, we need to populate our talk groups. Now, what is the list of talk groups called? Is it called the talk group list? No, it's not called the talk group list. That'd be too easy. It's called the contact list. Okay? So again, talk groups are used to split up a time slot. Again, not always a good idea, but that's what it's used for. We've kind of gone over this information already. Blah, 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 blah. It's called the contact list. Okay? Now, contact list isn't used just for talk groups. Obviously, talk groups are first, but it's also used for this thing called private calls. And then we need to talk about private calls real quick. Let me place this out, talk groups. And there's one thing called the all call. All call basically means if a radio sees the all call number come through, no matter what talk group it's set up for, it will open the radio and it'll let you listen. Okay? So that's basically the broadcast, built-in broadcast feature inside the DMR radio. Okay? Now, let me see if I put this on the thing. Yes, yes, yes. So, contact lists are very, very fun because if you have somebody's private call in your contact list, like my number here, 3108111, and you have that in your contact list as a private call with conga mic, right? When you receive a signal from my radio with that ID, instead of your display showing 3108111, it'll show conga mic. Very convenient, right? Now, not all radios will hold a lot of contacts. This is one of those things that is a DMR focused thing. So most of the newer the Anytones, they advertise they will hold up to 500,000 contacts. Well, why do you need that many? Well, remember radioid.net, right? Radioid.net. What are we up to in radio IDs now? 300,000, something like that? Radio ID for a total number of DMR IDs that they've issued. So that means that if you want to, you can upload the entire radioid.net database of IDs and contact identifiers into your radio, which is pretty cool. Now, there's a dark side here because the DMR specification does allow you to make a private call. So when you go to transmit, instead of transmitting to a talk group, you would transmit to a private call or a private ID in your contact list, right? This is bad practice in amateur radio because it does two things. One, it obscures the transmission from other people, so it's not a broadcast, which goes against regulation. And the second thing is that you're tying up an entire repeater network for one person to listen to.
It is terrible, terrible practice. We do not allow it on the RMHAM network. If you do it, you will fall into our de facto sternly worded letter FCC thing. You know, we will contact you if you try to do this. Please don't do this on the RMHAM network. It's bad, 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 bad. Okay? But they're very, very useful for this kind of thing, right? That's very, very cool. So we do encourage it. As a side note, because PowerWorks it will resells Anytone radios. If you go to their software download page, every day they publish an importable list of all the radio IDs and the labels for the entire radio ID list. They export it and put it up on their website for you to download in an already formatted format for your Anytone radio. It's very cool. All right, so in the code plug, it looks like this. And you just click on a line in here, it brings up a page. You type in the ID, specify whether it's a group call or a private call, and then give it a label. Simple as that. And you just add them in until you got all the ones that you want in.
So with the contact list here, is this different than the 3,000 or 300,000 plus list as well?
Tricky question, because the answer to that is yes and no. Can you put your private calls for your contact list here? Yes. Should you? No. Why? Good question. There is a separate section called the digital contact list. And the Anytone manages these separately. So you can, because if you put everything in here, it starts getting really muddy real quick. So in the Anytone, the practice is you put your talk groups in the contact list, and you put your private calls in the digital contact list. That keeps them separate. The other cool thing about this is that when you get the import, like if you put talent on for the PowerWorks site, you import it, it imports here instead of here, so it doesn't muddy up your list. Now, advanced topic. You can, if you want to, import the digital contacts list there and save your code plug. I do not recommend doing this because what that means is every time you open the code plug, it has to open all the information in that code plug, including the digital contact list. That list is huge, and it makes everything in the CPS run dog slow. Now, this is a problem because we want to be able to push that contact list to the radio. The good news is when you go to push your code plug to the radio, you're given a choice. What do you want to upload? Do you want to upload the contact list, everything else, or both? So if you're just updating your contact list, what you do, you open your code plug, you import the contact list, you write to the radio choosing only the digital contact list. And it takes time because, again, that thing's huge. Once you're done and the contact list is in your radio, close the CPS and do not save. Because then when you open the CPS up next time, it'll just be the CPS and not the digital contact list, and it'll perform just fine. But the contacts are still in your radio. So key there is never save your code plug with your digital contact list in the code plug. You'll thank me for that the first time you do it. Because it runs dog slow. All right, that's a bit of an advanced topic, but this is where your talk groups go. It's just a list, and you populate the list. Any questions on the contact list? Excellent. So now that we've got the contact list done, we can do the receive groups. Again, with the onset of promiscuous mode and digital monitoring, this isn't as important. Also, with the newer radios, anything that you put as your contact, your transmit contact, is automatically listened for on the receive side, so there's that as well. They're trying to make it easier for you. But the best practice is still to create your receive groups and put your talk groups in there. That's the best practice, just to get into that mindset. So, again, we do this because you can have more than one talk group on a repeater slot, and if you want to be able to listen to all those talk groups, the practice is to put all those talk groups in your receive group so that you know when they're transmitting. Again, this can get confusing. It doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes. Remember the DMR doctrine. This is commercial radio stuff. It's not meant to make sense for amateurs. We're learning, we're shoehorning, yada, yada, yada. Okay? Now, in the Anytone software, it looks like this. You're selecting from a list. So when you click on a line in your software, that's going to bring up this receive group edit. You're going to give it a name, give your receive group a name, have it make sense to you, so that when you come back, you know what that receive group is supposed to be for. There will be a list of talk groups here. You select the talk group, and you hit this little arrow over here, and it puts it into the receive group. You're basically just assigning your talk groups to your receive group.
Also, another good reason to think about doing receive groups is if you ever want to switch to a Motorola or a Kenwood radio, you're going to have that.
Yeah. So that is how you populate your receive groups. You give it a name, populate it with the talk groups from your talk group list. Tedious, but pretty simple. Any questions on the receive group? All right, let's dig in. Color code. Remember what the color code is, right? It's a color, right? Yeah, it's a number code. We use that to, it's the first line of access into your repeater. It works, it functions the same, has the same function or same purpose as a CTTS or DTS tone. It's not a tone. Why is it not a tone? New guys, why is it not a tone, do you think? Digital, which means number, it's ones and zeros. Digitals are ones and zeros, and there's such concept of the tone. So it works, DMR works simply, if you're familiar with networking, and we're familiar with networking packets, right? It just puts information in the header of the packet. That's all it is. It's header information, okay? So there's no tone, right? I've had a couple of folks come to me in the early days going and say, well, why don't you just call it a tone? Because it's not a tone. Well, it would make it easier for new hams to understand. No, it wouldn't, because it's not the same technology. It's not the same thing. This is a whole new thing. And it's not a tone. We're talking digital. We're talking packets. And calling it something similar to something else is not going to help with understanding. When we can say it's a packet, it's a little packet in the header, and it has the same function as a tone, right? Either keeping people out or whatnot, right?
Each repeater has only one color code.
That is correct. So any one repeater will only have one color code assigned to it for the entire repeater. Okay? And then, of course, again, our repeater slots, right? We have slot 1 and slot 2. It's either a repeater slot or a time slot. Those terms are used interchangeably. You have to be on the same slot in order to communicate with somebody. You can listen with dual mode rescue all you want, but if your channel is set to transmit on slot 1 and somebody is transmitting to you on slot 2, if you transmit on slot 1, they're not going to hear you unless they are also dual side promiscuous mode. It's kind of silly, okay? But if you want to transmit on time slot 1, you have to know that you need to program your channel to transmit on time slot 1 and time slot 2, the same thing, okay? And then finally, again, we talked about zones. Zones are required. So in order to be able to switch between the channels, you need to have your channel in the zone, and you have to have your zone selected in the radio. Now, if you only have one zone in your radio, the radio is going to default to that one zone, but you can have more than one zone. And yes, you can mix digital and analog channels in the same zone. Perfectly allowable. Okay. Where did I put the, I thought I had a slide in here for the channel. Did I hide it accidentally? A moment, please. Apparently. Well, let me do the thing, please. There it is. All right. So this is what the channel looks like. This is the final countdown, the final product. Okay? So we give our channel a name. Right? Here is our frequencies. Again, top box, receive frequency. Bonus. So that receive frequency is the transmit frequency of the repeater. Good. Here's our transmit frequency, -5 offset. That's the transmit frequency that the repeater is listening on, right? Some of these things are some advanced stuff that you can look at. Typically, you don't need to touch them, so we're not going to talk about them. Here's the important ones. Digital, channel type. Okay? This is a digital channel, which means it's going to be a DMR channel. What's the other option that you think is in that list? Analog. Excellent. Transmit power. For our workshop today, if you are programming this channel, please put your transmit power to low. We don't need 5 watts going through this room for most channels all at the same time. Now, next one is bandwidth. You'll notice that since we have the digital channel type selected, the bandwidth is set at 12.5. Because in the commercial world, there's no such thing as a wideband digital channel. Okay? If you change the channel type to analog, you will have a choice between 12.5 and 25. Okay? So if you're programming your radio for a typical amateur radio analog repeater, you will need to set this to analog and then set your bandwidth to 25 kilohertz. Otherwise, it's going to be a little weird. What happens? The signal doesn't get as strong? Or would it, 25 kilohertz. So if I set my analog channel to 12.5 on a 25 megahertz repeater, we can do the repeater, right? So do that. Okay, now, here's something confusing. And this is something that changed over time. So the transmit permit. So this is when you key up, and it's the process that the radio does in order to transmit to the repeater, okay? So what this means, because there's same color code and different color code, and it's very, very, very strange. Different color code means is that if there is a different color code transmitting on this channel, you can transmit. The other one is same color code. So, and I don't know why same color code is in there, because if the same color code is transmitting, you shouldn't be able to transmit. So this gets a little confusing. But we know this one works. So for general DMR use, you want the transmit permit set to different color code. It's Anytone. Just let that go. All the stuff down here really doesn't matter except for this DMR mode. They added the DMR mode in the Anytone starting with the 878. I don't think they have this in the 868 CPS. But if you are talking on a repeater, for whatever reason, and we figured this out the hard way, you need to set your channel to repeater. It's the same thing with hotspots. There's some kind of signaling it does and uncovered handling that it does. It doesn't work on a repeater unless you have that set to repeater. Take my word for it. This is what all the samples are set to, okay? Now we come to the other side, which is the other stuff. Remember when I said that the CBS does this weird? Sometimes it's a pull-down menu, sometimes it's a button. To select the contact, for whatever reason, and I'll show you this in the demo, to select the contact, you press a button. So if you want to change this to the contact, which is your talk group that you want to talk on, so why didn't they label that talk group? Rant, rant, rant. So for the talk group, to select the talk group, you go to contact, you click the button, and then it gives you all of your talk groups in a grid. And then you double click on the entry in the grid for the talk group that you want, and that's how you select your talk group. Why did they do this? I have no answer for that. Okay? Now, remember when we had the radio ID list where you could specify more than one radio ID? Remember that? Okay? Here's where you select which radio ID you're going to transmit on this channel. This is a Anytone thing, right? You don't find this in the TYT software, okay? Now, by default, you have one radio ID. You just leave it at the default entry and just ignore that, okay? I don't even use this, just the one thing. Now we can continue. Color code is next. Here's your color code, which is conveniently a pull-down list, right? Here's your slot, which is a pull-down list. Select it up, very good. Here's your receive group, which is a pull-down list. Select your receive group, right? So everything's a pull-down list except for the talk group, which is a button and a grid. Why? Why, Anytone, why? It makes no sense to me. If it makes sense to somebody else, please let me know. So this is what you need to specify on your channel for DMR. Any questions besides my ranting?
Yeah, I don't have a, yeah, Mike, it's something to point out. You mentioned earlier, if you go to, analog, and you talked about the
Yeah, I was
bandwidth.
going to get to that. Any questions on the DMR digital side? Right, now if you select analog here, all of this goes away. And there's a separate analog section at the bottom. And here you have your standard stuff. Your DCS, CTS, encode and decode, your squelch mode, what you're using over here, your two-tone decode, all that stuff is over here in the analog section for your analog channel.
Yeah, but I think the one thing to point out is about the transmit, so it's not color code free. You want it to be transmit always on analog for a repeater.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very good. So for an analog channel, and this is another Anytone thing. Let's get into the software and let's look at this in the software because this is going to make more sense. Okay. Give me a few quick moments to find. Any questions while I'm getting this prepared? No questions?
Yeah, is there any sort of forum where users can get together and ask questions and commiserate, like Groups.io or something like that?
I tend to stay away from forums because they can be such a wild, wild west. Does anybody know of any good radio forums? We do have a co-plug group, but that's an email list, not a forum. Talking about online forums. Anybody? Bridgestone might have a forum, but like I said, I don't know of one because I tend to eschew them. We do have a co-plug emailing list, and of course you can always email me directly. I'll have a banner at the end of this with my email address on it. And your PayPal address? No. So I need to do that.
You know how it works with this kind of thing. Every new thing you learn starts 10 more questions.
Yeah, of course.
So are you probing 878 plus 2?
I'm sorry?
Are you programming an 878 plus 2?
Yeah, so this is the 878 2.
Okay, so I have an 878.2 here, and when I try to read the CPS, it tells me the wrong mod. I'm running the wrong model.
Okay.
And if I look at the text in the CPS version, it doesn't say that this is for the plus 2.
So it's for the 2. So this is 878. There's an 878.2. So in order to get the code plug to read from the radio, you need the right code plug version, and it has to match your firmware. So if you have an older firmware, the newer code plug software might not be able to read the older firmware, the older firmware. So again, we'll get to that here in a second. All right, so let's look at a channel. Where is my mouse? So here's our channel. Can everybody see that well enough? Okay. So let's look what happens here when I change from analog to digital. No, from digital to analog. Here's analog. Okay. So here comes our bandwidth here, transmit power. Where is... This is... DMR mode is off. Check that. Yep. Busy lock. Oh, here's busy lock. Okay, so it changes the term to busy lock, and you can see our options here. So there's channel free, different CDT, and off. Okay, channel free just means that it's supposed to mean that the channel isn't transmitting. Okay, different CDT it relates to the stuff down here. Now, what we discovered, as Dave was alluding to, I think originally, is that most analog radios, when you set that kind of an access mode, once the transmission stops, but the transmission tail is still transmitting, it'll allow you to transmit. Anytones don't. So that channel free means that the tail has to drop. So if you have a conversation going on between two normal amateur radio radios, and they're constantly popping in while the tail is still up, you'll never be able to get into transmit because it's waiting for the tail to drop. You have to wait for the tail to drop before the radio will allow you to transmit. So in order to keep you sane and keep you from pulling your hair out on an Anytone When you are programming an analog channel, set your busy lock to off. Now, this means that you will be able to double with somebody. But sometimes it is the only way that you can actually transmit while the tail is up. And if you don't want to wait for the tail to entirely drop, this is how you have to set it for your analog channels in Anytone. It is a major pain in the butt, but that's just the way it is. I need to do some more testing to see if this is still the case with the later firmwares, but this is what we're still advising to keep you from pulling your hair out. Okay? All right, so to kind of give you, like they show you again, here's my digital channel. Here's my digital channel. Here is, now I only have one talk group in there, but this is what it looks like. It just brings you up a grid with all your talk groups for whatever reason. It's really, really strange. And I want to set this to contact 1. Well, here, double click that, and there's my contact 1. It's bizarre. Let's look at some of the other CPSs here. If I go into, put that down, 868 UB2. There we go. So this is this is our sample code plug, I believe. No, this is actually my personal code plug, but it starts with the sample as a base. So I go here to a channel. Here's a DMR channel. Again, if I go to this contact list, it just gives you a grid of all the talk groups that you have programmed. And then to select it, you double click on the grid square that has the talk group you want. Why they didn't do this with a pull down menu, I will never understand. But this is the latest CPS for the 8682, the 3.04, and this is how it's set up. Still there. It's bizarre. All right. Questions or anything that anybody wants to see in the CPS?
I guess I'll just make, one comment that
Okay, question on the Zoom?
Mike, this is Joe Butkovich, N0RTD. Question on that contact list. Say I've got 20 contacts in there, and I decide I want to pull a couple of them out. So now I got some blank spots. If I go in there and rearrange those, is that going to mess up all my programming to the zone, et cetera, or do I have to just leave it go the way it is with those blanks in there?
My answer to that question would be to just leave it as it is. And if you want, if you're like you have serious OCD about these kind of things, which I can do at some points as well, as long as you use the same number and label, it should be fine if you change it to a different location, right? But if you make that change, always go back to your channels and make sure that the contact is still set on the channel before you upload to your radio. Always double check.
Okay.
All right. Now, did anybody program their channel into the radio while we were talking here? You did? Okay. How brave are you?
I'm getting audio again. What happened?
It doesn't look like it's getting in. Oh, I know why. Hold on. Sorry, this is my fault. Give me a moment. Now, if you're on a hotspot and you've used WPSD or Pi-Star, this is something you want to be aware of. What is your radio ID? This is something they've added for security purposes. (3209879). Okay. This is to keep people from cutting into your hotspot security. No, not yet. It's still applying. So for those that are out there looking at this, this is running on a Pi 02. Give it a second. Radio status is showing us offline. Resetting all the things. Pretty colors. And dark mode. Okay. There we go. There it is. So you have your talk group set up as 31081, not 3108. The software never lies. So the good news is you did transmit, and you transmitted on 31081. The bad news is that I don't think 31081 is a valid channel, and nobody's listening. But that worked. So you are transmitting properly. That's cool. All right. Questions to this point? All right, we're going into a bonus round. All right. Now, this is something that when I started out on my Anytone journey, what happened there? Oh, I know what. Windows. Okay. So this was something I wish I knew on my Anytone journey when I started, because it would have made my life much easier. Okay? Now, there are different CPSs for each model of Anytone. There's a different CPS for the handheld and the mobiles. Okay? The old code plug won't read the new firmware. The new code plug software won't read the old firmware. All these different things, right? So, what do you do if you have a code plug from one model of Anytone radio and you have a different Anytone radio? You have to start from scratch? Is there a way around it? Yes, there is. I love this quote from Buddy Walk in the Chocolate Factory. This is when Veruca Salt's father tried to keep her from signing the contract at the beginning of the movie. She goes to her father, "Give me that pen! You're always making things difficult." I love that. That's fun. All right, so export-import mode. So why do we need this? Why is this cool? So Anytone updates their firmware and CPS frequently on their currently supported radios. Okay, code plugs don't always open between versions. Right? Code plugs aren't always compatible between models. And code plugs are always compatible between sub-models. So we look at the 878, right? The newest 878. If you look at the CPS, it seems to suggest that there's a separate American version, commercial, a different European version, a different amateur radio version, right? And each one of those are different. And if you take a code plug that was programmed for an American amateur radio and try to push it to a commercial Anytone radio of the same model, it won't work. We can get around this with the import-export. Okay? So what do? We take the code plug that you have and you export it. You export everything. You export it with a list. And the data is saved in .cbs files. So it's just plain text. Okay? Then the data can be imported to any Anytone CPS regardless of model. Right? Any unnecessary data is ignored. Right? So the 878 doesn't do APRS. And APRS is part of the spec in the 878 too, right? So if you try to import a list with APRS data, it just says error and it ignores it. Everything else is imported.
Thing with the frequency, if it was a commercial and you're going to import it in, that it's going to say, hey, no, that's out of band.
It'll import it, but the channels won't work. Okay? So it's a little secret now that every time now in the last few times that I have put up the CPS or the code plugs For the Anytone radios, I include the export. Okay? So that means is that even though you have a radio that isn't on my list of supported bits, as long as you have the CPS that works with your radio, you can import our coplug into your CPS. So it doesn't matter if when they've updated the firmware, updated the CPS, that export will still work. Hallelujah. No, not theoretically. I've tried this over and over and over again, right? And so I've exported the 8782 and I've imported into the 868 and it works, okay? Case in point. Let's do this. We're doing this live. This is where it gets exciting. I forgot to do the keep changes. That's why I did that before. All right, so let's do this. You notice here, I have got the 168 CPS. Radio's not even released, okay? Not even shipping, but they have the CPS up on the Bridgecom site. Okay? Here is a fresh, unadulterated default coplug. Okay? All right, so now you guys get to see my some of my where did my mouse go? There it went. Okay? So we're going to go up to Tool. So this is where you'd export. See this export all default CBS file name? That's what you want to use. You want to use that button at the top. That'll export all of your coplug in separate CBS feeds for each section for your entire coplug. Okay? Then, when you go to your other CPS where you're trying to import, you go to Tool, you go to Import. Now, you can import each one of these individually, right? If you're doing the digital contact list from PowerWorks, right, you would import that using the digital contact list button, right? But if you have everything, you just go up the top and you say Import from File List. Okay? Now here's the Anytone samples that I have. And it's not showing it because it's looking for a list file, but in that sample, there is a folder called Export. And that export folder is that list file and all the CSVs. So I'm going to click that, and I'm going to click Open. And it says File, Import, and List, yes, and I hit Yes. And it's going to import. Now we're going to get some errors. Let's look at these errors. Import from file ever AES encryption code. We don't do encryption. We don't care about that. Import complete. Boom. There's all my channels, right? There's all my zones. There's my scan lists. And we don't do roaming. Go to digital. There's my radio ID, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the sample. There's my contact list. And if we go up to our channel, let's pick a random channel, right? Random channel, there's the name. There's the radio pair, digital high, different color code. RMHAM South is a scan list. Rocky Mountain is my contact, right? RMHAM sample, color code 7, slot 1, Rocky Mountain receive group. I now have a functional 168 coplug. I don't even own the radio. Import, export is your friend. Now, next step. All of this stuff is exported as CSV files, right? Let's say that I want to add channels to my coplug. Do I have to do it in the coplug software? No. What can I do? Edit my CSVs, right? So if you have, this is a common thing. So we have people that really like the samples. We love the fact that you like the samples, but we've always said that the samples are a building block for your own coplugs, right? Take it, change it, expand it, add to it, make it your own, right? But what happens when a new sample is released with new repeaters? What you can do is take your coplug, export it to the CSVs. Go into the CSVs and find the data that you've added, your contact list, your channels, and copy those out into a separate CSV, right? Very, very simple. Then when a new coplug is released, we release it with the export. You take that new export that we release, add back your channels, and then import it, and now you've got a new coplug with all the new stuff in the sample and your own stuff. It makes it easier, especially for folks that are used to working with CSVs and spreadsheets, to manage their own coplugs and their own data. It's a fantastic, fantastic tool that is absolutely underutilized. So this is something that I strongly, strongly recommend that you get used to, the import and export. Questions?
From playing with multiple CPSs,
Yes.
I found that you build your first channel or a couple like an analog channels, you do an export, and by kind of going through the CSVs and looking at it, it's always helped me to be able to kind of understand it more and to program from starting out with a blank code plug and just kind of building on it.
Yep.
And then you can do some spreadsheet gymnastics on the sample code plugs from the Rocky Mountain Ham website.
And you can copy and paste, right? You don't have to build an entire channel from scratch. Just copy, paste, and then change the things you need to change. You can do that in the CPS if that's better, easier for you, or you can do that in the CSVs if that's easier for you. You have choice, and it's glorious. Absolutely glorious. Any questions on the export? All right. We get down to our final slide. Ba-doop, ba-doop, ba-doop. Okay. Like I said, I wish I would have known about that early on when I got started. It would have saved me tons of time. All right, so some basic information, the RMHAM website, if you've never been to it, sample code plugs, all the information on the DMR things. I have an interactive DMR repeater map. Yes, there's turbo in the URL because we did this way back in the day. But generally speaking, it has all the general locations of where our repeaters are. So if you're like, what's my closest repeater? You can go to that map and know where the closest repeater to. Doesn't mean you'll be able to get into it because you're on the wrong side of the mountain. Nothing we can do about it. RadioID.net, where you can get your radio ID and look up radio IDs as well. Brandmeister, so all the information about Brandmeister website. It's still very Wild West days, and they're kind of picky about how you access things. Don't do weird stuff with it, but if you got a hotspot, this is a great way to get out to an international community over the internet with radio. If you're going to deploy your own hotspot, you must, not an option, you must go to the ccarc.net/WordPress/hotspot site, because there they have allocated frequencies that you may freely use for your hotspots. Please use these frequencies. It keeps everybody happy. And my arl.net contact email. Questions or other things? Willem.
All kinds of questions.
Oh boy.
So I have a Virgin Anytone 878 UV2 Plus.
Yes.
Step one, I need to unlock the keypad.
We've been working that. We haven't been able to figure that out.
So I press the minus in star, and it says press the dial key.
I have no idea what the dial key is. We've been trying to figure that out. I have no idea what that means.
So how do I figure out what firmware I have so that I know what soft CPS that I need?
That's a very good question. Google. No, you can't Google what firmware is on your radio. Google how to do the dial button. Well, that's going to be my step. So yeah, we're going to have to work on that. But that's an interesting thing. Someone has brought in a radio today that the keypad is locked, and the keypad process is not what's in the manual. So we're trying to figure that out. Other questions?
Because when it boots, it doesn't give you the CPS version.
Any other questions? All right, we will leave that there. Thank you everybody for coming. If you're local here and you have some time, I will be coming around to try to help out folks with different things. But as far as the official presentation, I believe that's the end. Any closing words that we need to do?